World War II gave us radar, jet engines, and the atomic bomb, but it also gave us a rectangular metal container that soldiers initially mocked, then stole, then copied wholesale, and we're still using the exact same design 80 years later. So let's break down every major invention that came out of the Second World War, starting with the one nobody thinks about: jerry cans. The Allies thought German fuel containers were over-engineered nonsense. Then they actually used one and realized it was the best piece of military logistics equipment anyone had ever designed. The Germans called it the Wasserfeld Flaschenkanister, which is why everyone else immediately stopped using that name. It held 20 liters, had an X-shaped indentation on both sides, featured internal baffles to prevent sloshing, and came with a removable cap and locking handles. British forces reverse-engineered it, adopted it, and named it the jerry can after slang for Germans. Here's the thing: fuel containers don't sound exciting until you realize wars are won by logistics. Allied fuel cans leaked, corroded, and required tools to open. German cans were airtight, stackable, and could be opened by hand in 3 seconds. That difference extended supply lines across North Africa and into Europe. The original design remains unchanged today. You can buy one at any hardware store right now, and it'll look identical to the ones Rommel's Africa Corps used in 1942. But if you think a fuel container is impressive, wait until you hear about the technology that let pilots fly high enough that enemy fighters physically couldn't reach them. Pressurized cabins. Germany's Junkers. Ju-86R could fly at 41,000 feet, higher than almost any Allied fighter could intercept. That's over 12,000 meters. In airspace where oxygen is so thin that conventional aircraft engines simply couldn't operate, and pilots would pass out without assistance. The Ju-86R had a pressurized cabin, allowing it to reach altitudes where it was functionally untouchable, and yet only a handful were ever produced. The Lockheed XC-35 pioneered experimental pressurized flight in 1937, and the Boeing 307 Stratoliner became the first commercial pressurized aircraft in 1938, but Germany weaponized the technology first. The Ju-86R could conduct reconnaissance missions at extreme altitude without fear of interception, making it one of the most advanced aircraft of its time. But manufacturing capacity limitations meant this technological edge never translated into battlefield dominance. Only a few aircraft rolled off the line, and the advantage evaporated. One innovation, no matter how advanced, cannot win a war if you can't produce it at scale. Today, every commercial aircraft maintains cabin pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet, while cruising at 35,000 feet or higher. Pressurization fundamentally changed aviation, enabling the high-altitude bombing campaigns and long-range flights that defined late-war strategy. At least pressurized cabins gave pilots a fighting chance at altitude. But if you think flying higher than the enemy is an advantage, wait until you hear about the technology that let the Allies see them coming from 40 kilometers away. Radar. Britain had dozens of radar stations watching the sky before anyone even called it radar. And that's not hyperbole. Chain-Home had roughly 50 operational radar stations by mid-1940. detecting aircraft at 40+ kilometers range, while the actual term radar, radio detection, and ranging wouldn't be coined by the US Navy until 1941. Here's the thing, the Battle of Britain would have been lost without this technology. The Luftwaffe had numerical superiority, advanced fighters, and every tactical advantage. But Chain-Home gave RAF controllers early warning of incoming attacks, enabling efficient interception despite being outnumbered. Without radar, Britain faced invasion or forced surrender. One technology fundamentally changed World War II's trajectory before the war even reached its midpoint. The magnetron tube, a British invention from 1940, was crucial for microwave radar development, turning what was essentially experimental equipment into a reliable detection system. Germany developed its own Würzburg radar by 1941, but by then, the Battle of Britain was already decided. Historians still debate how much credit belongs to radar versus pilot skill, tactics, and aircraft design. Aviation enthusiasts fixate on Spitfire mythology while completely overlooking the radar infrastructure that enabled every single effective interception. The planes get the glory. The invisible radio waves did the work. At least radar detected threats from a distance, unlike the weapon that couldn't be detected at all once it launched, the ww2 rocket. The Nazis invented the first weapon that couldn't be stopped. Wernher von Braun's team built a missile that reached space, traveled faster than sound, and killed you before you even knew it was coming. No air raid sirens, no defense system, no warning, just sudden death from above. Around 3,170 V-2 rockets were launched during the war, killing approximately 9,000 civilians and 5,000 Allied troops. What made it genuinely terrifying wasn't the body count, it was the physics. The V-2 hit targets 320 kilometers away after climbing to 85 kilometers altitude, literally crossing into space. By the time it descended, it was moving faster than sound, so the explosion arrived before the sound of the rocket's approach. You were dead before you heard it coming, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Allied forces tried interceptor aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, radar tracking, none of it mattered. Once that rocket launched, it was already too late. Both the US and Soviet Union immediately abandoned their own rocket programs after the war to capture V-2 technology and the scientists who built it. Von Braun's team became the foundation of NASA and designed the Saturn V that put Americans on the moon. The Soviets grabbed their own V-2 experts and launched Sputnik. Every ICBM, every space program, every satellite. It all traces back to this Nazi revenge weapon. And von Braun, he died a hero of American space exploration despite using slave labor to build rockets that bombed London. But at least the V-2 only killed thousands. The next medical breakthrough on this list saved hundreds of thousands, though the man who invented it was denied the very treatment he created: blood plasma transfusion. Dr. Charles Drew perfected blood plasma transfusion, and nobody talks about him. And I can prove it. Before you dismiss this as just another medical advancement, hear me out. Blood plasma transfusion didn't just save lives, it fundamentally changed what was possible on a battlefield. Up until 1940, if you got shot and lost too much blood, you died. Simple as that. Whole blood transfusions existed, but they required blood type matching, couldn't be stored long, and definitely couldn't be transported to frontline combat zones. Drew solved all of that. He figured out how to separate plasma, the liquid part of blood without the red cells, and mass produce it. Plasma worked on anyone regardless of blood type. It could be stored for months instead of days. It could be shipped to battlefields in Europe and the Pacific without spoiling. The results were staggering. Survival rates improved by approximately 50% compared to the pre-plasma era. Soldiers who would have bled out in previous wars walked away from their wounds. But here's where it gets dark. Drew was a black physician at Howard University. His work saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Allied soldiers, civilians, everyone. And the US military segregated blood supplies by race throughout the entire war. They literally separated Drew's life-saving invention based on skin color, as if blood plasma somehow cared about melanin. Medical history communities point out how underrated Drew's contributions are, and they're right. But if you think segregated blood banks are disturbing, wait until you hear about the machine that broke Nazi codes and accidentally invented modern computing. The Enigma machine and bomb. The Enigma machine had 158 million possible configurations, which sounds completely unbreakable. And yet, it was broken repeatedly throughout the entire war. Here's the thing. Nobody captured an Enigma machine and suddenly cracked the code like in the movies. The breakthrough came from Polish mathematician Marian Rejewski, who built the first bomb in 1938 using pure mathematical insight. British cryptographers at Bletchley Park, notably Alan Turing, refined it throughout the war. By 1940, the British bomb was fully operational. They built 211 of them. Breaking Enigma is estimated to have shortened World War II by 2 to 4 years and saved 14 to 21 million lives. But here's where it gets dark. Winston Churchill knew the codes were broken. He also knew that using the intelligence too obviously would tip off the Germans that Enigma was compromised. So he made calculated decisions to protect the secret over immediate tactical advantages, which means he knowingly allowed attacks to proceed, let people die to preserve the intelligence source. Historians and ethicists are still troubled by this moral calculus, and honestly, who wouldn't be? Let people die today so fewer people die tomorrow. That's the math Churchill was doing. The cryptography community celebrates Turing's genius, rightfully so, but Rejewski's foundational work often gets minimized despite being the actual starting point. There's also ongoing debate among historians about whether Enigma breaking truly shortened the war by years, or if other factors were equally decisive. The evidence is solid, but incomplete. Wartime secrecy destroyed many records, and the life-saving estimates are mathematically derived projections, not precise counts. Still, the consensus is clear. Breaking Enigma was one of history's most consequential intelligence achievements. At least code breaking didn't require petroleum products. Unlike the next invention, which became absolutely critical when Japan seized every major rubber-producing region in Southeast Asia. Synthetic rubber. When Japan seized Southeast Asia in 1941, they didn't just take land, they took every major rubber plantation the Allies depended on, which meant tanks, trucks, aircraft, and basically the entire war machine were about to grind to a halt unless someone figured out how to make rubber without trees. And they had about 6 months to do it. The US responded by scaling up synthetic rubber production at a speed that still doesn't make sense. The first large-scale plant opened in 1942, churning out GR-S, government rubber styrene, which is exactly as bureaucratic as it sounds. By 1944, American factories were producing 231,000 tons of synthetic rubber annually, representing roughly 60% of all rubber used by US forces. That's not a small industrial adjustment. That's rebuilding an entire supply chain from scratch in the middle of a global war. Here's the thing nobody talks about. This wasn't just a military achievement. The government launched civilian scrap rubber campaigns, asking ordinary people to hand over old tires, boots, anything rubber. Citizens were literally donating their garbage to keep the war effort moving. Without that synthetic alternative, mechanized warfare itself would have stalled. No tires means no vehicles. No vehicles means no supplies. No supplies means losing. Materials scientists view this as incremental progress rather than some revolutionary breakthrough, and they're not wrong, but the scale and speed of deployment, that was the real innovation. Synthetic rubber is still the standard in modern tire manufacturing, which means a wartime panic solution became the global industry norm. At least rubber shortages didn't involve ghosts or experimental torture, unlike the terrifying technological leap that came next, which made every previous engine obsolete overnight. Jet engines. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was so fast it made Allied pilots genuinely terrified, and I can prove it. Frank Whittle patented the jet engine concept in 1930, and by 1937 he had a working engine. Germany's Hans von Ohain independently developed his own the exact same year, because apparently two people on opposite sides of a continent decided piston engines were for chumps simultaneously. But here's the thing, only one of them turned it into a weapon that actually saw combat. The Me-262 entered service in April 1944, reaching 900 kilometers per hour. That's faster than any Allied fighter at the time. Not slightly faster, significantly faster. Allied pilots reported seeing German jets blow past them like they were standing still, which, relatively speaking, they kind of were. Britain's Gloucester Meteor entered service around the same time frame, but production remained minimal. Germany built approximately 1,400 Me-262s during the war. The Allies, fewer than 20 total jet fighters before 1945 ended. But here's where it gets complicated. Hitler initially wanted the Me-262 as a bomber, not a fighter. Material shortages meant production stayed limited. By the time it arrived in useful numbers, the war was already lost. So you've got this aircraft that terrified Allied leadership, represented a genuine technological leap, and arrived too late to matter. Jet engines made piston aircraft obsolete by the 1950s. Every commercial flight you've ever taken, every military jet since, traces back to this technology developed under wartime pressure. But if you think a revolutionary aircraft engine is impressive, wait until you hear about the accidental discovery that came from warming up a chocolate bar near military radar equipment. Microwave technology. Every microwave oven in every kitchen on Earth exists, because Percy Spencer had a chocolate bar in his pocket near a magnetron tube. That's it. That's how this happened. Here's the thing. Radar technology was absolutely critical during World War II. British engineers John Randall and Harry Boot invented the magnetron in 1940 at Birmingham University, which generated electromagnetic waves for detecting aircraft. It was revolutionary for radar. And then in 1945, Percy Spencer at Raytheon was standing near an operating magnetron when the chocolate bar in his pocket melted. Not because the room was hot, because the microwave radiation heated it directly. Spencer realized what was happening immediately. He grabbed popcorn kernels, placed them near the magnetron, and they popped. Then he tried an egg. It exploded in a colleague's face. By accident, he discovered that electromagnetic waves between 1 millimeter and 1 meter in wavelength could heat food faster than any conventional method. The first microwave oven, the Radarange, was over 6 feet tall, weighed 750 pounds, and cost $5,000. In today's money, that's approximately $75,000 for a single appliance. It was designed for commercial kitchens, not homes. Microwave ovens didn't become commercially available to regular consumers until 1967. Today, billions of devices use microwave technology: ovens, cell phones, Wi-Fi routers, radar systems, satellites. A wartime radar component accidentally became the foundation for modern communication and food preparation. And yet, despite overwhelming scientific consensus, persistent unfounded safety concerns about microwave radiation continue circulating in health forums. People genuinely believe microwaves cause cancer or destroy nutrients in food, likely because Cold War misinformation about radiation never fully died. Meanwhile, cooking enthusiasts debate whether using a microwave even qualifies as real cooking. None of that changes the fact that Spencer's accidental discovery revolutionized how billions of people eat every single day. But if you think melting chocolate changed the world, wait until you hear about the machine that accidentally invented modern computing: programmable digital computers, Colossus. For 30 years, computer history was completely wrong. Every textbook pointed to ENIAC in 1946 as the first programmable digital computer, but they were all off by 2 years, because in January 1944, while World War II was still raging, a machine called Colossus Mark I went operational at Bletchley Park, and it was already doing what ENIAC wouldn't do until 1946. Here's the thing. Nobody knew this until the 1970s. Colossus was so classified that the British government destroyed all the documentation after the war and made everyone who worked on it sign the Official Secrets Act. They dismantled the machines, burned the blueprints, and pretended it never existed. For 3 decades, the foundation of the computer age was literally erased from history. Colossus was built to crack the Lorenz cipher, used by Hitler's High Command for Strategic Communications. The Mark I used approximately 1,500 vacuum tubes and could perform about 5,000 operations per second. At least 10 of these machines were built during the war, processing encrypted messages that directly influenced D-Day planning and the endgame in Europe. But here's where it gets weird. When Colossus was finally declassified in the 1970s, it retroactively rewrote computer history. Historians had to revise decades of academic work. ENIAC didn't lose its importance, but it lost its claim as first. And because Colossus had been secret for so long, British computing contributions were completely overshadowed by American narratives. The US got credit for inventing the computer age when Britain had actually beaten them to it by 2 years. The really tragic part is that we don't even have complete documentation. Because the British destroyed everything, historians had to reconstruct Colossus from photographs and surviving engineers' memories decades later. A machine that should have been celebrated as one of humanity's greatest achievements was instead buried, dismantled, and nearly forgotten, and the people who built it couldn't even tell their families what they'd done. At least Colossus advanced human knowledge instead of just destroying it, unlike the next invention, which saved millions of lives by accident: penicillin. Alexander Fleming found penicillin in 1928 when some mold contaminated a petri dish in his lab. Then, he basically forgot about it for over a decade. Before you dismiss that as wasted time, understand the context. Fleming's discovery was interesting, but useless without a way to mass produce it. The pharmaceutical industry looked at his moldy plate and said neat, but no, and they had a point. Nobody knew how to isolate enough penicillin to treat even one patient, let alone an army. Then the war started. In 1939, Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain's team at Oxford decided Fleming's forgotten mold deserved another look. By 1940, they successfully isolated and purified penicillin. Clinical trials began in 1941, and the results were so dramatic that infection treatment went from amputation or death to, here's a shot, you'll be fine, almost overnight. Mass production began in 1942. The US government mobilized pharmaceutical companies the same way it mobilized weapons manufacturers. By D-Day in June 1944, Allied forces had enough penicillin to treat battlefield wounds that previously meant almost certain death from infection. Fleming discovered it. Florey and Chain made it work. War made it matter. What's striking is the timeline. 4 years from laboratory curiosity to mass-produced battlefield lifesaver. Wartime urgency compressed a process that should have taken decades. This single medication is credited with saving tens of millions of lives in the decades following its introduction. Penicillin didn't just change medicine, it created modern medicine. The dark side is what came after. Antibiotics became so commonplace that overprescribing became routine, and now antibiotic-resistant bacteria are a genuine threat. Penicillin's success created the conditions for its its own obsolescence. Medical historians call it the greatest pharmaceutical achievement of the 20th century, while simultaneously warning we're approaching a post-antibiotic era where the same infections penicillin conquered could return with no treatment options. But if you think saving millions with a moldy accident is impressive, the next invention didn't save lives. It ended them on a scale so massive it fundamentally altered what it means to be human. Nuclear fission, the atomic bomb. In December 1938, Lisa Meitner and Otto Frisch described nuclear fission theoretically. 4 years later, Enrico Fermi's team achieved the first controlled chain reaction, and by 1945, the Manhattan Project employed 130,000 people, cost $2 billion, and built the most destructive weapon in human history. The Trinity test on July 16, 1945 proved it worked. 3 weeks later, Little Boy killed 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly in Hiroshima. 3 days after that, Fat Man killed 40,000 instantly in Nagasaki. Combined deaths exceeded 200,000 by year's end. Japan surrendered August 15th. Here's the thing. The atomic bomb wasn't just another weapon. It was the convergence of physics breakthroughs, industrial capacity, military coordination, and scientific genius into something that fundamentally altered civilization. It didn't just end the Pacific War, it created the possibility of species-level extinction. Every single decision made since 1945 has occurred in the shadow of nuclear capability. We invented a way to delete ourselves, and we can't uninvent it, and historians still cannot agree whether it was necessary. Some argue Japan was already on the verge of surrender, that the bombs were overkill meant to send a message to Stalin about post-war power dynamics. Others point to Japan's refusal to surrender after Hiroshima, requiring a second bomb, as proof they would have fought to the last civilian. Military analysts debate whether invasion would have cost more lives than the bombs did. Ethicists ask whether any calculation justifies vaporizing 200,000 civilians. There is no consensus. There probably never will be. But the weapon exists. Nuclear fission powers submarines, generates electricity, enables medical imaging, and sits in silos pointed at every major city on Earth. The Manhattan Project proved that scientific progress doesn't care about morality. It just moves forward, and whether that's humanity's greatest achievement or its greatest mistake depends entirely on what we do next. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.